I think warm-ups are overemphasized, ineffective, and in most cases, unnecessary. At school, running onto the playground, I would play football without warming up. At home, I would run out onto the garden trampoline without warming up. At university, I would start throwing and shooting the ball in a handball without warming up. But most sports club coaches told me, oh, you need to warm up before you get injured. And most of the coaching courses that I've been on also tell me to do a warm-up for all of my participants, and I'm even assessed on what those warm-ups do and look like. So as a coach wanting to make the most of my time during practice, I had a look at what the science says. Now, to address this right from the start, a warm-up doesn't prevent injury. While there is little evidence to suggest a positive effect on injury reduction, there is no evidence to suggest a negative effect. Unless, of course, someone gets injured during a warm-up, which happens in participation and performance sport. Unless the warm-up creates so much fatigue that performance is reduced, increasing the likelihood of injury, or if the warm-up impedes a person in some way before the session starts. Most of the papers that I'm finding say things like, further trials are needed, or there is contradictory evidence. So a warm-up doesn't prevent injury, but it can help and doesn't really have a negative effect. But what do we actually mean when we say warm-up? Magnus is a very good climber, a professional climber before he decided to become a full-time YouTuber. I've been watching Magnus on YouTube for years, and I've heard him say multiple times that he doesn't do a warm-up. But he does start with simple boulders. Goran, apologies if I've said that wrong, talking about an optimal running warm-up, actually starts with slower running. And he also found research which said
performance difference with the two warm-ups. But what's even more interesting is that they did a third way of warming up, which basically was no warm-up at all, just sitting still before the test. And also here they found no difference in performance compared to the two different ways of warming up.
Then there's Gotham Chess, someone else I've been watching on YouTube for years, and before a game they go through some practice lines. Chess, of course, having lots of preparation typically before a match. But that's not what we're told to do on these sports coaching courses. Yes, chess is a sport, just like darts, snooker, and Tiddlywinks. I was told at school you start with a pulse raiser to increase the blood flow and the heart rate and respiration rate, etc. Then you move on to do some stretching or mobilization. I'll probably expand on that later. And then you finish up with some sport-specific movements. If you go on the internet now, you'll probably find the same sorts of guides. And for those curious, a gym workout isn't necessarily sport, but it's certainly physical activity, so I think it should be involved in this discussion as well. And if we look at Jeff Nippard alongside most of the other lifting and fitness coaches on YouTube, they talk about warm-ups and add loads of different exercises in there, but despite all those differences, they always seem to build up the load to get to your working rate, your working load, your working reps, i.e. sport-specific movements. Going back a few years, Jeremy said,
when done properly, a warm-up provides several benefits that can translate to better muscle gain over time.
Improved strength and performance, okay, something worth exploring, but what does proper warm-up mean? Running laps of a field will certainly get a chess player warmed up, but I don't think that's going to help them play chess. If anything, it might actually make them worse because they're tired. Raising the heart rate, the body temperature, the respiration rate needs to be appropriate to the upcoming activity. So assuming we're talking about physically demanding sport, Dr. Andy Galpin said,
It is honestly very dependent upon the person.
However, that's in relation to gym workouts where the focus is normally on maximum strength or power output. And so Andy goes on to say,
you need to differentiate if you're training for speed, power, strength.
Which is what I said earlier about fatigue affecting performance. Andy then adds this.
And generally those communities are not going to count any repetition as a working set until you exceed 70% of your 1 rep max. Where that's changed because of a lot of people doing the velocity-based stuff is now they're basing that simply on an achieved velocity. And so really the warm-up is irrelevant. They don't even, it's sort of just like do whatever you want and we're gonna measure the barbell until you actually hit an outcome. And now you're at a working set.
So we can do what we want until we see the performance metric measured, sport-specific movements increasing in quality. But in sports like football, basketball, boxing, or the sport that I coach, trampoline, what is that sport-specific performance metric that we're going to measure? How hard you kick throw, punch, or jump, I imagine we want control, not necessarily maximum strength or maximum power. The focus on the practice on skill development rather than physical adaptations. Yes, granted, when we're doing exercise, you're going to get both of them anyway, but this measured performance metric requires some representative practice, playing some simplified version of the sport or of the game, skill-specific movements. Now, we also don't do warm-ups between exercises. You'll see a traditional lesson plan go warm-up, drills, game, conclusion. You wouldn't see warm-up, drill, warm-up, drill, warm-up, drill. I think you get the point. So a proper warm-up is anything that gets you feeling ready and helps you get the performance metrics you're measuring. But what about the stretching and mobilization phase? Recommendations on stretching, like most things in sports science, is still heavily debated. Static stretching during warm-ups has pros and cons. It stretches the muscle, which prepares the body for exercise. But too much static stretching could decrease performance, and therefore potentially increase injury risk. And then a caveat here, as someone that's hypermobile and works with hypermobile individuals, static stretching isn't going to help. We don't need more range of motion, we need control at the joints. But then dynamic stretching has pros and cons. It maintains movement while stretching, so it doesn't make the pulse raiser kind of redundant. But I often see and hear exercises with a lack of control, which actually increases the risk of injury during stretching. Another caveat here, when I did dynamic stretching when I was younger, the coaches used to say, push harder, you can go further and try your best, which is nice in principle, but looking back now as someone hypermobile, that probably contributed to my shoulder and knee injuries, pushing my range of motion too far during dynamic stretching. I think of a couple of words from my master's degree in strength and conditioning now when I'm talking about stretching. Range required. Do I really need to get the palms of my hands on the floor with straight legs before a football game? No, not really. It's not the range required. So if we do static or dynamic stretching is better to be done before activity, but how far do you go? How far do you stretch? And this relates to the comment from Jeremy about strength and performance earlier.
You need to differentiate if you're training for speed, power, strength.
Go too far, we could hinder performance. Don't go far enough. Is that still warming up? Well, yes, because there is movement, but assuming there is sport-specific movements to follow this stretching session, there are still opportunities to be activating and mobilizing the joints. Thinking about what Dr. Galpin said, a proper warm-up helps us feel ready. And this is where I actually like to use a paper that I read during my S&C degree from Ian Jeffries about effective warm-ups. Yes, I recognize the paper is over a decade old now, but with the gap between literature and practice, I still feel like a lot of what is said is relevant to the conversation today. In its simplest terms, the goal of the warm-up is to prepare the athlete mentally and physically for exercise or competition. I think we can all agree on that, but what that looks like is the point of this video. This system identifies 3 key phases of effective warm-ups: raise, activate and mobilize, potentiate, also known as the RAMP protocol, R-A-M-P protocol. So using the RAMP protocol and using trampoline as the example because that's what I coach, the first question I have is do I and how do I raise the heart rate, the body temperature, respiration rate, etc, etc? Well, the methods used to achieve it often represents perhaps the biggest waste of valuable training time in many programs, with the common jog around a field still a common sight. In trampoline, this is often relay races or follow the leader or Simon Says or some version of Simon Says. My current trampoline assessment has me doing a 5-minute floor warm-up for a 30-minute trampoline session. That is a 1/6 of the session on the floor with no one on the trampoline. My question as the coach, is that an effective use of time? Maybe share your thoughts in the comment section on that one. But phase 2, activate and mobilize. Rather than focus on individual muscles, the approach is to work on movements. This phase is where we would see the static or dynamic stretching more dynamic because active. But when I think about trampoline, we are in a straight shape, standing up, we're in a tuck shape and a pike shape. You might see a straddle or a star shape, but that's less likely. So apart from curling up into a ball and touching our toes a couple of times, I'm not sure what else you can really do. Especially as Ian also writes, the movements are more specific to those found in the sport. So for trampoline, surely that would include elements of jumping. Maybe say some straight jumps on a trampoline, or tuck jumps, or pike jumps, or shape jumps, building up the quality of the movement. Quick note here, doing shape jumps on the floor is actually harder than doing them on the trampoline, so it's probably actually not a useful option, especially for those that struggle with knee and back pain. But this jumping on a trampoline doesn't sound like the mobilize and activation phase. This sounds more like a sport-specific phase. Which brings us on to phase 3, potentiation. This phase of the warm-up will see a gradual shift towards the actual sport performance or workout itself, and will normally involve the sport-specific activities of increasing intensity. I did my undergraduate degree dissertation on a PAP response for trampoline jumping. The idea was to get individuals to do a close to maximal back squat, then go to the trampoline and see if they jump higher. Turned out there were insignificant results. My guess is because the trampoline skill is highly skilled, and doing some squats to potentiate the muscles wasn't enough. PAP standing for post-activation, so afterwards, potentiation improvement. Which brings me to the biggest considerations when considering the potentiation phase of any warm-up. The optimal warm-up is likely to vary between sports. Also individuals, as mentioned earlier, but then also the level of performance, and also where the person is actually coming from, because maybe they've just come from an after-school club, or they've just come from football training or rugby, and now they're going to go to trampoline or basketball, so they're already warm, active, and mobile. On the other hand, it could be a really warm day, so you don't need such a long or separate warm-up. Just because the session has a specific start time doesn't necessarily mean all the participants need to raise, activate, and mobilize. They could go straight into the potentiation or sport-specific phase, increasing sport-specific skill intensity. And that is what I did at school, going onto the playground playing football. It's what I did at home, going on the garden trampoline. It's what I did at university, going to play handball. It is also what Magnus does when he goes to climb, what Goran does when he's talking about running, and also what Jeff and all the fitness influencers are doing when they're in the gym. Taking an ecological approach to coaching made me question the idea of warm-up. A section of time at the start of the session preparing for something measured. Heaviest lift, hardest punch, fastest kick, highest jump. But when we are focusing on skill development, it's about the relationship between organism, us, and the environment, the coaching situation, sport, game we're doing. Why don't we just start the practice? Continue moving. For the trampoline session, get them on the trampoline. For football, give them a football. For basketball, give them a basketball. The raise and mobilize phases can happen during the potentiation because you start with low intensity and build it up. It is first more representative, it's also more time effective, and more importantly, it's more fun. This then changes my question from an effective warm-up to effective practice design. Now, of course, all of this depends on how you classify a warm-up, but for me, when I consider the traditional warm-ups of separating things at the start of a session, I think it's overemphasized, ineffective, and often unnecessary. Get them playing the game, it's far more fun. And I'll be doing a video about fun coming out soon, and as soon as it's out, I'll leave it up here, but until then you could watch the video that YouTube is suggesting you to watch right now.